What we found out later was that there was our story had basically stopped what could have been a very serious cover-up. The state already had called in, once our story hit, the state police went and got another medical examiner from New York and brought him in, tried to get him to modify the autopsies. He refused. He confirmed Edlin's findings. There were stories that came out subsequently, years later, about various attempts to try and keep this story from unraveling. But one of the impacts of the story was that it was a very dramatic shift from looking at the evil inmates who had killed these hostages to suddenly call into question how the state police had behaved when they'd retaken the prison. One of the things that came out is before they went in, the guns that they took in with them were not registered by serial numbers to any individual person. All of the troopers took off their ID badges and their name tags. They all wore the same slicker and the same gas masks and helmets. So in photographs, they're indistinguishable one from another. There were actually photographs of individual troopers shooting people at point-blank range, but no one could say which trooper that was, and no trooper would say which trooper that was. So it was a dynamic shift in how the story played out. What's interesting, though, is that because of the initial report, there's still a fair amount of people 40 years later who think that the hostages were all killed by the inmates and not the other way around. The case went through the New York courts for several years. There were several inmates who were charged with various crimes in the course of the investigation. Only one was convicted. That was a fellow by the name of Pernasalis, who was convicted of killing Billy Quinn, the first fellow who died. There were trials, there were indictments, and no one was ever convicted of the riot. At the end of the riot, the results were that there were 43 people dead, 39 of them that were killed on the day of the assault. It was 10 of them were the hostages, and 29 were inmates. There were other inmates who were killed by inmates during the riot, whose bodies were found later. But it was a story that continued to ripple on. As a matter of fact, now even 40 years later, there was an investigation last year by reporters in New York State, and the state is still refusing to release documents that they sealed 40 years ago, looking into the Attica prison riot. As a reporter, I went back to my beat after the riot, and spent the next year covering crime and corruption in Rochester. The day of the announcement of the Pulitzer, I remember quite well because it was a day I had a day off. It was a Monday, and I was told that there was going to be a staff meeting at 4 o'clock that afternoon at a local restaurant. So I'd gone in on my day off, walked into the restaurant, and here's like half the staff of the newspaper in the restaurant, and then the managing editor came in with the wire copy off the AP wire announcing it, and he announced it in front of the crowd that John and I had won. Unbeknownst to me, my son was then 1 year old, and they had sent a babysitter to my house so that my wife could come down and be part of the process. So after that, it was one very, very large party. I called my mother in Grand Rapids and told her I'd won a Pulitzer, and she says, "This is a pretty big deal, huh?" She says, "I got a call from the local paper wanting an interview." So, yeah, that was the, after that, I got a nice promotion, became an investigative reporter, and moved on with my career. As a result, the state actively went to recruit more black prison guards. It caused a cultural change within the community. It caused somewhat of a cultural change within the prisons. The prisons are still in trouble. They're still overpopulated. And the way people treat each other in prison is still a major national issue. But I think that one of the things that the outcome, had the outcome been different, had the story not come out, had it looked as if the inmates were the killers in this case instead of the state police, I think the status quo would have continued much longer, and it would have taken longer for the change.